right, I'm sitting down here with Patrick Barb, who has written quite a bit of stuff, including his debut short story collection, pre-approved for Haunting, which I have read, and it turns out he's a bit of a podcast pro, so I have my work cut out for me here. But Patrick, how are you doing?
I'm doing all right, Joey. Thanks for having me on the show.
Absolutely, absolutely. I have listened to some of the podcasts you've been on, by the way, and I know that you are a very good time as a guest, so I'm excited to have this conversation with you. The first question I have for you, just maybe just tell us about Pre-Approved for Haunting. As I understand it, it's a quote debut short story collection, but you in no way are a debut author at this point. You're actually pretty well established. So tell us a bit about the collection.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of the history of it. So I really kind of got serious about my writing. I've always wanted to be a writer since probably like first grade, but I got really serious about writing short stories, sending them out, working on craft and prose, probably around end of 2018, going into 2019. And what that entailed basically was just sending out stories, getting rejections, and then eventually getting acceptances and starting to build up a backlog of stories that have been sold to anthologies, websites, magazines, and things like that. And eventually it all kind of comes to a head, and you have enough stories and you have enough what you can consider to be good stories that you wouldn't mind people reading for a second, third, or fourth time. And that's the point where I started looking at assembling a short story collection. Many of my favorite writers are horror authors that work in the short story form, whether it's John Langan, Brian Evanson, Kelly Link, uh, Laird Barron as well. So I really wanted to have this collection. So I had one of my writing mentors, Richard Thomas, who I've taken several of his classes with. He has the Storyville classes about short story writing and just like the form and dark fiction and everything like that. He connected me with his publisher, Turner in Keylight Books, who he had done his collection Spontaneous Human Combustion with. And so I put together the 18 stories that are in the collection. I assembled sort of a pitch, put together a pitch, and basically the pitch is sort of saying, here's who I am, here's what these stories are about, here are some of the themes I touch on, here are some of like the subgenres that I work in these stories, and send it to the editor there. And they said yes. And then they kept saying yes up to the publisher, which is what you want. You want to just keep getting the yeses and then not get a no. And that's basically what happened there. And so by the time this collection had come out, I had already had two novellas published and a novelette. And actually, I'd had another novelette published as part of a double book with another author from Dreadstone Press as well. So I had not only to have this, as you said, like this kind of catalog of stories that had come before, but I also had now I have this collection to sort of showcase my short fiction as well. And it's been great to see the response, to see people picking up the stories. For a lot of people, that haven't necessarily read the stories the first time they were out on websites or anthologies, it's great to see to give people a chance to read the stories for the first time and to really get to experience them all at once. So that's been cool.
Yeah, and I actually messaged you after a little bit of diving into the short story anthology, and I just said, admittedly, I'm not a huge fan of short story collections. I
Hmm.
like longer works. I like diving into characters and environments. These are some of the coolest short stories I've read in horror fiction, and I truly mean that. I
Yeah.
mean, everyone. It seems like there's a real love for horror tropes, and there's a love for literary form, and you do a lot of playing around with that. I do want to get back to that, but since you talked about the journey you had into putting all of this into your own collection, Could you maybe, obviously with not without giving away any financials or anything like that, talk about what that process is like between submitting to another publication, getting the rights back, and then being able to putting everything together? Because I think a lot of people don't realize when you're submitting these short stories and they're getting accepted, you do eventually get these rights back and you can repurpose them into a collection.
Yeah, and that's something I always like tell people to look out for. And you look at the contracts. Obviously, one of the things that's going to be included on the majority of contracts is an exclusivity period. And basically, what that means is this magazine or anthology or website has the right and the sole right to publish the story for X number of months or less than that. So you have the exclusivity period on your contract. You look at that. I would say average for a lot of the like small press places where you're going to get published is probably about 3 months, maybe 6 months. Places that pay pro rates should, in my opinion, be the only ones that maybe try for rights for a year. Anything over a year is way too much. And if a place is not paying you for the work, I would say as much as possible, try to make sure it's not a no exclusivity. But anyway, once you have these stories that are out of their exclusivity period, and you need to have, I think, a substantial amount. I think opinions differ on how many reprints are in a short story collection versus new stories. The trend used to be, and in more traditional kind of mid-tier to higher tier publishers, to be more reprints. We want to have more of stories that people know, and then you have one or two new pieces to kind of say, hey, this is a new thing. So the other thing to look for, and then on the other side of that, is that newer publishers sometimes will do more new stories. But for me, I wanted to have more of a reprint mix there. And so once you've got your collection of stories, then it's a matter of putting it together in a way that has a kind of flow and rhythm to it. At least that's what I was trying to do with this collection. Is I wanted to have kind of, there's many themes in the collection. It's a mixture of longer stories and flash fiction, and like you said, different experimentations with form, kind of assembling them in such a way that, for me, I like to have readers who read it all the way through. I know you mentioned that you kind of picked and choosed a little bit, which is fine. I think that's whatever way people want to read it is great, as long as you're reading it. But for me, it's like I want to have the experience of being able to go from story one to the final story, and feel like you've gone on a kind of a journey in a certain way, with my writing. So once I had that kind of order assembled, and it actually stayed that way throughout the process, the order of the stories that I chose stayed that way throughout the process. And we went to the editor, and like I said, I had all these stories available. And actually, during the process of putting the book together, one of the stories that was going to be an original story in the collection, the Have You Seen My Missing Pet, actually got picked up by the podcast Nobody Reads Short Stories, which is a YouTube sort of show where they do sort of live reading and discussion of the story. And so that actually turned into a reprint kind of halfway through the process.
Awesome. And there were, I believe, 3 short stories that you wrote specifically for the collection, correct?
I think it's five,
5?
actually.
Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
there are five
Um,
total.
did you begin writing those when you knew that you were going to put this into a collection, or were these stories that you had written before deciding to do that?
It's a mix. The majority of them were stories that just hadn't found a home yet. And I think I mentioned this on a previous podcast, but I think it's worth repeating here, and as much as I can. What I've found with putting a collection together and being able to include some of these stories is that there are certain stories, if you're a short fiction writer, that only work in the context of a collection. So let's say there's a call, you're sending out to anthologies, you're sending out to magazines, you're trying to find a home for this story and you can't find a home. I contend now, having put this collection together, that there are some stories that have to be read in the context of other works. So there's some stories that work better as part of a collection, as part of this complete experience of reading, versus having it be a lone piece in a magazine or website or anthology.
Mhm. And you talk about the structure a little bit where I didn't bounce around completely. I did read
Okay.
some in sequence, and I did find that there was a nice mix of you have longer stories and then shorter stories, and then the last one, which is a very very cool story. That one is pretty long, and it almost reminded me of the last episode of Stranger Things season 4, where all of a
Hmm.
sudden we have like a 2.5 hour epic, right? And I thought that was a really cool way to end the whole anthology. But speaking of that story, um, I talked about how there seems to be a real love for genre tropes here. With that one, and especially the Bunker 7 story, um, is subverting genre tropes something that you intentionally set out to do, or is it just something that comes naturally to you as a writer?
Again, I think it's a mix, really. I like playing with the tropes. I like playing with the toys that we're all familiar with and finding new stories to tell with them, finding kind of new angles on the story. So in the case of something like There Is No Bunk Number 7, that's one where it is a kind of classic final girl slasher situation, except the slasher is this kind of liminal space cabin at a summer camp that shouldn't belong. It's not supposed to be there. There are not supposed to be 7 cabins. So why is this cabin following her around? And in the case with the last story, the Jalo Kid in the Cataclysms campgrounds, that is again a slasher story, but it turns into this kind of cosmic horror, post-apocalyptic brother and sister, who one's the slasher, one's the final girl, kind of bigger epic tale. Just because I love all these tropes, whether it's slashers, you get a lot of slashers in this collection, or werewolves, or vampires, Frankenstein monster, whatever it is. I like to play in the familiar, but then get it a little bit different. So sometimes it's just the natural output of what I do. I'll start off thinking, okay, I want to do a Dracula story. And then it becomes like, what if Dracula was the champion of a pro wrestling federation and Renfield was like a jobber? And that's my novella turn. And so like it all starts from this position of I love these things, but I want to see them in a little bit of a different form.
That's great. And funny enough, a lot of these stories actually inspired me to think of if I ever did some kind of anthology myself, it would probably be some kind of collection of subversion of genre tropes, like some of these stories. So I found it to be a really, really fun read. So why pre-approved for Haunting versus all the other titles? That one seems to be the one you stuck with for the title of the full collection.
Yeah, it took me a long time to come up with the collection title. I think it's because it's really like that's the main thing you're gonna see when you're in the store. If you're on Amazon, like you're gonna look at the title and you're gonna look at the cover, and it's really got to do a lot of heavy lifting. I personally couldn't think of any like non-story title to use. So I was kind of in this position where, okay, I need to find a story in the collection that has a title that not only works for itself, because that's the first job the story title got to do, but also has to work for every other story in the collection. And part of the copy that I actually wrote originally in the pitch that I sent to Keylight and Turner, and that actually survived into the jacket copy for the hardcover, talks about it's about strange stories and like millennial anxieties. And so a lot of these stories are kind of inspired by kind of what you call like an elder millennial, zennial, uh, um, Oregon Trail generation, all that sort of like
Trail
cusper kind of
generation.
thing.
Very good, very good.
Yeah. So
You remember the old Macintosh
I
computers
do. I
with the
remember just
clear
the the
yeah.
uh, the whole kit and caboodle there. Mm. And so a lot of the stories are addressing themes and emotions that I have been contending with for the last 4 years, like starting a family, uh, moving away from friends, sort of that transition between childhood to young adulthood to sort of like full-fledged old man adulthood, or like middle age, or whatever you want to call it, and like home ownership as well. Like, what does it mean to like have property or own something, or start a family, have these responsibilities? And a lot of the stories in some way I think touch on those issues. Pre-approved for Haunting is a story that is basically about a paranormal investigator who keeps getting called in back to this same house. And you see him from the time the house is being built to kind of like the last visitor, the last resident of the house. And he goes there each time, and they're all convinced that there's a ghost there. But he's saying there's not a ghost, there's no actual deceased person in this house, but there is another presence that's there. And it's this idea of being haunted by things that haven't happened yet, being haunted by the future, by the potential that's there. And for me, that felt like such a millennial anxiety. Really, it felt like something we're all like, we, you know, this generation kind of people feel and experience regularly. Is like, what is the future going to look like? We're all in the midst of that. I think just you look at like climate change, you look at like other things that are happening. um and also it was short. I mean, I'll be honest with you, if you set aside all the thematic ones, it was short, it's snappy, it works. And then like the way we constructed the cover for the book is basically it's like a dingy, dark basement, and there's like a creepy teddy bear on the cover. And there's also a key like you would get when you get a new a house. They give that little keychain with the house on it, and they give the key there. We've got it's happened to me like twice now. So yeah, thanks for my my lovely wife's good job there. So you know, it is a it's taking that moment that should be this like inspiring great moment in life, and imbuing it with fear. And the cover designer, William Ruato, who did the work there for Turner, I think he really nailed the tone and everything that I wanted for with the book. So that's basically, you get the title, you get the right cover, and you know when that happens, it's awesome. It's great to see.
Yeah, it's very striking. Even the interior formatting is really cool too. It's something I love to ask people that put out a short story collection is whether you have a favorite out of the entire collection or a couple favorites.
Yeah. You know, I Pre-approved for Haunting is definitely one, because I think that one was one, it was originally published in Boneyard Soup magazine, which was a great, had like a 1 year run, but it was a really stellar kind of weird fiction, horror fiction magazine. And I had a few stories in there that for its one and only a year of publication. So I really like that one because I really think it kind of nailed some of the themes that I was interested in. Jalo Kid, the last story in the collection, is another one, just because for me, that one feels like the most of my, if I had a brand or if I had a kind of like a type of story that I like to write, that's it, because it's got slashers, it's got weirdness, it's got cosmic stuff, it's got family. And it's because I think, you know, ultimately I want to be able to like marry the weirdness with character. And this is a brother and sister story ultimately, except one is a giant hulking monster, you know, and the other in this post-apocalyptic landscape. So that was a fun one to write. And also, because that one had never been published before, it's been great to see people like yourself connect with it and say like, "Oh, this is really cool." So those are probably my two favorites. But really, I do love all of my word babies, and you know, they're all special to me.
Yeah, it's not usual that you see a story that or sorry, that begins with the end of the world and you call it the cataclysm, right? Which is really
Yeah.
cool. And then it keeps going and you have, you know, basically zombies that have died at the hands of this brood at the camp. It's really, really cool. Um so I do want to talk about your prose because one thing I found striking is how awesome your detail is, your analogies, your metaphors. So how do you construct this stuff? Do you go through really quickly, do what I call a zero draft or a vomit draft and go in and fill in the detail, or do you methodically go through and try to craft some really great prose just from the jump?
Yeah. My process is basically I edit as I go. So there is a lot of refinement that occurs. So I have found that getting success in writing means being productive in writing. For me, that's my definition of success, outside of any factors that I can't control. Like for me, being a successful writer means that at a certain time or certain times every day, I sit down and write. And it's usually around lunchtime. It's around right before my kids get home from school, and then there's a little bit of time in the evening where I will write as well once they're in bed. And so being able to stick to that schedule means I know what to expect when I sit down in the chair, sit down at the desk and write. So what I usually do is I'll start a draft of a story and I'll write to till the time is up. Then when I go back to write in the next session, I'll start where I started the last session and I'll edit that part and then keep going. It's like you're passing the baton off in a relay, right? And so then I'll get it till it's to a new endpoint, come back the next time, start from where I started at that session, and so on and so forth. And what happens there is you kind of refine and you um, really kind of get the language to be the way you want it to be. I am more of a maximalist when it comes to writing. It's more of like that. Richard Thomas, my mentor, is that way. Not comparing myself to this person, but like Cormac McCarthy is also like a maximalist. You're really getting deep into the scene. You are adding a lot of visceral, sensual details into the um, description of a place. I had a hard time when I was originally starting writing prose. I always felt like I had good dialogue, but I had a hard time with setting. And the way I improved, honestly, was just to focus on that and to write into the setting and to think not only about what you are seeing in a scene, but also what does it smell like? What does it sound like? And I think those sort of additional sensory details, you don't need to use many of them, but they can make a world of difference. They can set a scene in a way that if you're just using visual cues, maybe you won't get it across to readers. And I think what I've found, or at least what I believe is happening, is that's what people respond to. And there are some times I will say where the method that I use doesn't always work. There are times when you're writing a story, and let's say you get about halfway through, and you're like, "This is not. I don't know where this is going." And that usually, for me, means that something way back several sessions has been wrong. And when that happens, I will start back from page one and just go all the way through and edit the whole thing. And it's a pain, especially when I'm moving into writing longer works now. And man, I'll tell you, that can be a real pain in the ass. But this, um, sometimes that's just what you have to do. You have to listen to the story and kind of figure it out that way.
Yeah, so is the approach at all different depending on the length of the project you're working on? If you set out to write a short story versus you set out to write a novel or a novelette?
It's similar, but there are some differences, I think. I think there's a little bit more forgiveness with a longer work where you can maybe know or mark a section that needs to be fixed when you do like the kind of a bigger revision pass. Even with the short stories, like once I'm done with the whole thing, I will read through it. I will, run the spell checks, run the grammar checks, but also kind of like read it as a whole, which is easier to do with short stories than longer works, obviously. But still, I think with a short story, you do have less real estate, so you can kind of like bounce back to the beginning. Whereas with like a novel or something, you're maybe bouncing back to the beginning of the chapter or maybe like one chapter back. And usually that's enough to kind of, if not write the course, then at least put a pin in it for later.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about success as a writer and what you think that means personally, but a lot of people would look at your body of work so far and go like, "Oh, this is a successful writer. You've been published by a lot of reputable presses. You have your own short story collection, more stuff on the way." Moving forward, what does success look like to you, and what are you looking forward to from your writing career?
Yeah, that's an interesting one because I have I have writing friends. I have like people that I'm in writing groups with that talk about their feelings of not being successful or they're making a comparison and say, oh well, you've had this and this published, but then I'll come back and say, well, you've been published in this magazine that I haven't been in. So I think there's always this like such this sense of like the grass is always greener on the other side, but at the same time I recognize that I've had a lot, as you said, a lot of success. I've had a lot of publications. I had 3 books out last year and I had 2 books out this year. The pre-approved for Haunting and then my novelette. So Quiet, So White was included in Split Screen Volume 3 from Dreadstone Press, along with another novelette from J.W. McCarthy. And yeah, I couldn't imagine having, like, when I started out, to think that I would go from, having one or two short stories published to having 5 books out there. It's wild to see that. And I credit a lot of that to just consistency, to just showing up every day, to sending stuff out, to, you know, there's a lot of ways you can find this path to success. Every path is different, as they say. But it's really true. There's this way of looking at it where, um, you have to be open to opportunities, and you have to be open to putting yourself and your work out there, and trusting that it will connect with people. So for me, when I look ahead and I look at what I have kind of lined up for next year, years after that, I just want to keep putting work out there. I've got a novel coming out next year from Dark Matter Inc. So, I've gone from writing short stories. Thank you. From
We
writing,
interviewed Angela Sylvain on the podcast, right?
yes. Oh,
Yeah.
she's great. She's
Yep.
fantastic. And that's a great book. Um, Going from short stories to novellas and novelettes, now working in this like longer novel form. Um, it's I feel like you're ramping up a little bit, and you're trying, kind of getting your name out there more and more. For writers, I know, like, I love the short story as like a writing form, but I also know that, um a lot of people will only connect with novels. It's like there are some readers who are just, as yourself, like, more novel focused, and that's great. But
You
I
might have turned me around a little bit. Just
Okay,
saying. You
well,
might have turned me around on short story collections.
there's another short story collection out next year as well. The children's horror, which is coming out from Northern Republic, and that is a more of a mini collection, themed with stories inspired by all the kids TV shows that I had to watch during the pandemic in the quarantine days with my kids. So it's like weird fiction takes on Paw Patrol or PJ Masks or Baby Shark and all these other things. And just imagine like the weird out there takes on those. So that's a really fun piece of work there. So I guess when we talk about success, it's just making that next connection, reaching more readers. For me, that's a big one. It's like reaching more people, and going to conventions, meeting people, doing shows like this. I just want to, like, I just love talking about writing. I love talking about weird fiction, horror, whatever. It's all fun to me. As long as I'm having fun, that's a plus.
Well, thank you for mentioning doing shows like this because this has been a podcast for like a month at this point, and
Oh man, but you got a
I'm
lineup.
just happy. I'm just happy
You're,
that you decided to come on.
yeah, no, this is fun. You had a great lineup, and get a chance to drink my coffee in the morning and talk horror. I'm always down for it.
That's what it's about. And going back to what you said about the consistency, I feel like I don't know if you probably noticed this, but seems like there was this huge boom of aspiring writers right around the time the pandemic started because, well, a lot of people had a lot more time on their hands and hey, I've always wanted to do some writing. But I also feel like there was a huge wave of disappointment with aspiring writers, right? Because they think,
Mm.
oh, this actually is kind of difficult. I mean, you don't just write your first couple of short stories and then poof, you're in some publication. So, how long would you say it took you to, for lack of better terms, refine your craft to a point where, okay, I know what I'm doing now?
Because I've had stuff published earlier. So like 2008, had some like comedy pieces, co-written pieces that are published. I had a couple of short stories that are published, but it wasn't until, as I said, right before the pandemic, when I left the publishing job that I had and we moved to Minnesota, and I went freelance and had more time on my hands to set up this regular writing schedule. Uh, so it probably, I would say, took about 2 years to 3 years. And I personally feel like I'm constantly improving. And that doesn't necessarily mean I'm like learning new things about grammar. I had a good seventh grade English teacher who's taught me like a lot of that stuff. Like, I know all that stuff. It's just the instinctual learning that goes on. And the instinctual learning is something you only get from doing, from practicing, from writing, and from failing. And I don't mean like failing, and I mean it could be failing in the way of getting rejected. It could be failing in the way of just like not being able to exactly express something the way you want to express it. And you get to a point where you're not ready yet to write it the right way, so to speak. And you'll learn that eventually, or you won't. And it's not just not something you're going to do. I think you're right. There are people who can jump into it and say, "I'm in the scene. I'm writing. Um, give me a book deal. Give me like put my stories in short story collections." And I think you gotta have those failures. I think it's a vital part of being a creative and developing yourself uh, as somebody who makes things is to fail at making them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And to talk to people about it, right? So with
Yeah,
you, I mean, you've gone on a lot of different podcasts and you're talking about your work and you're talking with other creatives. And I think, networking, it seems like an icky term a lot of times because we think about it in a professional sense, but networking with creatives is really, really important to improving your work as well. And it seems like that's something that you do quite a bit.
yeah, and it's not just the creative part of it, but it's also the human part of it. I think when you realize that the people who are writing stories, either your peers or the people who are maybe a rung above you on the ladder, that they're having the same sort of issues and concerns as you are, that can be really eye-opening and really also help with the writing, I think, because you just feel like, okay, everybody has the same worries. Let's focus on, you know, meeting people, having a good time, and then sitting down in the chair when the time comes and doing the work.
Yeah. So real quick, because we have about 5 minutes left here, I always like to ask writers about their relationship with social media and how they use that as a tool to, gain an audience, boost their writing career, etc. How do you feel about social media in general and as a tool for a writer to use?
I think it's an important tool, although it was more so. It feels like it's changing now with the kind of Twitter to X to the sort of it's decentralized in a lot of ways. So I think rather than have one hub where people are posting and getting their material, which was Twitter, Facebook for a certain generation, I guess, and now it's a little bit of everything. And you kind of have to be everywhere and forge these communities. So whether it's like the Blue Sky or X or Facebook, Instagram, Threads, which I'm hearing people are back on now, or like even like Discords and things like that. It's become this more of this like finding these little pockets of people. So it's important, but I'd also say, I mean, don't sweat it. Don't let it get in the way of doing the work. I think a lot of times people let social media posting count as their writing time, and it really shouldn't. It's just have fun with it, get your work out there. Don't get too much involved in things that people hate or don't like. Focus on what you love and share that with people.
Yeah, and I like the way you approach social media too, because there's not a lot of artifice to the stuff you post about. I mean, you'll just say, "Hey, I saw a really cool movie on Tubi," and I'm like, "Oh, that's pretty cool." So that's awesome.
Yeah.
Um, so what are you currently reading? What are you currently watching? Anything that people should know about?
Sure. I'm always reading something. So right now I'm reading Mongrels by Stephen Graham Jones, which I haven't read yet. And another Stephen, I'm reading The Shining for the first time, which I actually never read. I'm kind of going through some of the King, filling some of the gaps in my horror knowledge. Um, and then I'm also reading Abnormal Statistics by Max Booth III the third, which is a fantastic collection. I recommend it to anyone. Pick it up if you like kind of like vis visceral but slightly humorous, kind of like Jack Ketchum style writing. I think Max does a really great job with that. Um, as far as what I'm watching, I watch a lot of movies on Shudder. I watch a lot of stuff on Tubi every Friday night. I kind of have a little time to myself to watch horror. So I would say check out the horror selection on Tubi. they've got some really hidden gems there, or some hidden crap gems as well, if that's a term, just like some real bad movies. It reminds me of like being in the old video stores from my like hometown, where you would have like the big blockbusters, but also just like some B, Z grade schlock. And so I'd say
Exactly.
that's basically
Yeah.
what I've been entertaining myself with recently.
Yeah, you do have to dig sometimes to find those gems because there's a lot of man, have you watched a Tubi original? I don't think there's a single good Tubi
No,
original
I've
branded movie.
I've only seen clips on social media, which is another good thing for social media. If you want to see like really bad, kind of like domestic thrillers, look for the Tubi originals on there. There's some just real awful stuff there. It's almost so bad you can't watch the whole thing. Just you got to watch it in bits and pieces.
Yeah, I almost think it would be great to put on like on a big screen in the background of a party or something like that. You're like,
Exactly.
what in the world is this? It's better to watch without any dialogue. Okay, well, with that, we will go ahead and wrap it up. I really appreciate the conversation here. I think you
Yeah, it's
provided
been
a
great.
lot of really helpful insights for writers on this podcast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad to help, and happy to talk. Like I said, it's a good time.
Absolutely. Well, can't wait to see your other publications in 2024. And if you want to come back on and talk about those works, I would be more than happy to schedule another call.
That would be great. I love it. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Okay, I'll talk to you soon.